In December 2023, Netflix released a Korean drama called Gyeongseong Creature. It was set in the spring of 1945, in the final months of Japan's occupation of Korea. The premise was this. Beneath a Japanese military hospital in Gyeongseong, the colonial name for Seoul, scientists were conducting secret experiments on human subjects, injecting them with a parasitic organism that transformed its hosts into something no longer human. The show was fiction, the creature was fiction, the parasite was fiction, but the laboratory was not. Between 1937 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a network of biological warfare research facilities across occupied Asia. The largest and most infamous was a sprawling complex in the Pingfang district of Harbin in northeastern China, a place known by its military designation, Unit 731. What happened inside that complex is among the most documented and least discussed atrocities of the 20th century. Thousands of prisoners, Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, Russian, and others, were subjected to experiments that included deliberate infection with plague and cholera, vivisection without anesthesia, frostbite studies, and decompression tests. The prisoners were not called prisoners. They were called Maruta, logs, because the facility's official cover story was that it was a lumber mill. When the war ended, the evidence was burned, the surviving prisoners were killed, and the scientists walked free, because the United States government decided that the data was worth more than the justice. The Netflix drama, Gyeongseong Creature, imagined a monster created by these experiments, but there was no need to invent one. This is the true story behind the fiction, the story of how a military physician proposed the unthinkable, how a government built an industry around it, and how the world decided for decades to look away. In 1925, the nations of the world signed the Geneva Protocol, a treaty that banned the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. It was a response to the horrors of mustard gas and chlorine in the trenches of the First World War. Most major powers signed it. Japan signed it. Japan did not ratify it until 1970. Among the young Japanese military physicians who studied the protocol was a man named Ishii Shiro. He was born in 1892 in Chiba Prefecture, the son of a wealthy landowner. He graduated from Kyoto Imperial University's medical school, joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a surgeon, and by his late 20s had developed an obsessive interest in biological agents, bacteria, viruses, and toxins as instruments of war. Ishii's reasoning was chillingly logical. The Geneva Protocol, he argued, proved that biological weapons were effective. If they were not dangerous, there would have been no need to ban them. The ban itself was evidence that these weapons worked. And since Japan had signed but not ratified the protocol, Japan was technically not bound by its restrictions. In the late 1920s, Ishii began lobbying the Japanese military leadership to fund a biological weapons research program. His proposal was simple. Japan was a small island nation with limited industrial resources, competing against larger powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, China. Biological weapons were cheap to produce, devastating in effect, and difficult to trace. They were, Ishii argued, the great equalizer. He was persuasive. In 1932, with the backing of the Army's Surgeon General, Ishii was given authorization to establish a small research unit in Manchuria, the region of northeastern China that Japan had occupied the previous year and reorganized as the puppet state of Manchukuo. The first facility was modest, a small laboratory near the city of Harbin, disguised as a water purification unit. Its official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Its real purpose was to develop biological weapons and test them on living human beings. Ishii was 39 years old. He would spend the next 13 years building what historians now recognize as the largest and most systematic biological warfare program in modern history. By 1938, Ishii's operation had outgrown its original facility. the Japanese Army authorized the construction of a new complex in the Pingfang district, roughly 20 kilometers south of Harbin. The scale was extraordinary. The Pingfang complex covered approximately 6 square kilometers. It contained laboratories, barracks, a prison block capable of holding several hundred inmates at a time, an airfield, a power station, crematoria, and specialized chambers for conducting experiments under controlled conditions. At its peak, the facility employed an estimated 3,000 personnel: physicians, microbiologists, veterinarians, engineers, guards, and administrative staff. The complex was officially designated as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, the same innocuous name as its predecessor. In military communications, it was referred to as Unit 731. Locally, the cover story was that the facility was a lumber mill. This detail, the lumber mill, is important. It was the origin of the word that would become synonymous with the entire program: Maruta. It means log in Japanese, a wooden block, a piece of timber. The prisoners held inside the Pingfang complex were referred to as Maruta, logs, in all internal communications. They were numbered, not named: log number 1, log number 47, log number 312. The language was deliberate. By stripping prisoners of their names and replacing them with the vocabulary of a sawmill, the system made it linguistically impossible for its operators to speak of their subjects as human beings. The prisoners came from many sources: Chinese civilians arrested on suspicion of espionage or resistance, Korean forced laborers transported from the occupied peninsula, Mongolian prisoners, Soviet soldiers captured along the Manchurian border, and according to post-war testimony, a smaller number of Allied prisoners of war, American, British, and Australian, though the exact number and circumstances of Allied victims remain disputed among historians. What is not disputed is that once a person entered the Pingfang complex as a Maruta, what follows is difficult to hear. It is drawn from post-war testimony, the records of the 1949 Soviet Khabarovsk war crimes trial, the research of Japanese historian Tsuneishi Keiichi, and the accounts compiled by Chinese investigators at the Pingfang site. The details are established historical fact, though the precise scale remains uncertain because Japan destroyed most of its own records in August 1945. The primary purpose of Unit 731 was to develop biological weapons that could be deployed on a battlefield. To do that, Ishii's team needed to understand how diseases killed human beings, not in theory, but in practice. And to understand that, they conducted experiments on living prisoners. Prisoners were deliberately infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. They were injected or exposed through flea bites bred in the facility's insectaries. Researchers then monitored the progression of the disease: fever, swelling of the lymph nodes, organ failure, and at various stages, selected prisoners were taken to the operating rooms and vivisected, cut open while still alive, without anesthesia, so that researchers could observe the effects of the disease on living organs in real time. Anesthesia, they argued, might alter the results. The same procedure was applied to cholera, anthrax, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, and syphilis. Other experiments had nothing to do with disease at all. In the frostbite studies, prisoners were taken outside in the Manchurian winter, where temperatures could drop below -30 degrees Celsius, and their limbs were exposed to the cold until they froze solid. Researchers then tested various methods of rewarming the frozen tissue: immersion in warm water, application of heat, to determine the most effective treatment for battlefield frostbite. The subjects frequently lost their limbs. Many died. In the decompression experiments, prisoners were placed in sealed chambers, and the air pressure was gradually reduced until their bodies could no longer sustain life. Researchers recorded the point at which blood vessels ruptured, eardrums burst, and organs failed. There were experiments involving blood transfusions between incompatible blood types. experiments in which prisoners were deprived of food and water to determine how long a human body could survive. Experiments in which limbs were amputated and reattached to different parts of the body. Estimates of the total number of people killed at the Pingfang complex range from 3,000 to 12,000. The wide range reflects the destruction of records and the difficulty of verifying testimony decades after the fact. The most commonly cited scholarly estimate is that approximately 3,000 prisoners died within the facility itself. But this figure does not include the casualties caused by Unit 731's field operations, a subject we will return to shortly. I want to be precise here, because precision matters in a subject this grave. We know these things happened. We know them from the testimony of former Unit 731 members who spoke publicly in the decades after the war. We know them from the Soviet trial records. We know them from the physical evidence at the Pingfang site. And we know them because, as we will see, the United States government received detailed reports of these experiments and chose to classify them rather than prosecute them. What we cannot say with certainty is the exact number of victims. The records were deliberately destroyed. The crematorium at Pingfang operated continuously. The dead were not buried. They were burned. For Korean audiences watching Gyeongseong Creature, the history of Unit 731 is not abstract. It is personal. Among the victims at Pingfang, Koreans are believed to have constituted the second largest group after Chinese nationals. The exact numbers are unknown. Again, the records were destroyed. But post-war testimony from former Unit 731 personnel and surviving witnesses consistently identifies Koreans as a significant portion of the prisoners. How did they get there? By the 1930s and 1940s, Korea had been under Japanese colonial rule for decades, since the formal annexation in 1910. Koreans were subject to forced labor mobilization, military conscription, and the systematic suppression of Korean language, culture, and identity. Hundreds of thousands of Koreans were transported to Japan, Manchuria, and other parts of the Japanese Empire as laborers in mines, factories, and construction projects. Some of these laborers ended up in the Pingfang complex. Others were arrested by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, on charges of espionage, resistance activity, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In occupied Manchuria, where a significant Korean diaspora community existed, the Kempeitai had wide discretionary authority to detain and transfer prisoners to military facilities. The Netflix series Gyeongseong Creature sets its fictional laboratory in Gyeongseong itself, Colonial Seoul. This is a dramatic choice, not a historical one. There is no confirmed evidence of a Pingfang-scale biological warfare facility operating within the Korean peninsula. Japan operated military hospitals, research stations, and medical facilities in Korea. But the documented center of the biological weapons program was in Manchuria, not Korea. This distinction matters, not to diminish the suffering of Korean victims, but because historical accuracy requires it. The Koreans who were subjected to Unit 731 experiments were overwhelmingly transported to Manchuria. Their suffering happened far from home, in a facility whose existence was hidden from the world, under a system that recorded their deaths as lumber shipments. They were taken from their country. They were taken to a place they had never heard of, and they were never returned. After the war, the families of Korean victims received no notification, no explanation, and no compensation from either Japan or the Allied occupation authorities. For decades, most Koreans had never heard of Unit 731. The history was classified, suppressed, and ignored. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s when Japanese journalists and historians began publishing their research, and when Chinese investigators opened the Pingfang site to public scrutiny, that the reality came into view, that the full scope of what had happened began to reach Korean public consciousness. Unit 731 was not only a laboratory, it was a weapons delivery system. The biological agents developed at Pingfang were tested not just on individual prisoners, but on entire populations. Between 1940 and 1942, Unit 731 conducted a series of field operations in which biological weapons were deployed against Chinese cities. In October 1940, Japanese aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over the city of Ningbo in Zhejiang province. An outbreak of bubonic plague followed, killing an estimated 106 civilians, according to Chinese records compiled after the war. The operation was designed to test whether plague could be spread through insect vectors dropped from the air. In November 1941, a similar operation targeted the city of Cheongda in Hunan province. Plague-infected fleas were again dropped from aircraft. The resulting outbreak killed an uncertain number of people. Chinese estimates range from several hundred to several thousand, though precise attribution is difficult because wartime conditions and natural disease outbreaks complicate the epidemiological record. These were not isolated experiments. Unit 731 also contaminated water supplies and food sources with cholera and typhoid bacteria in various locations across eastern China. The full extent of these operations is difficult to reconstruct because of the destruction of Japanese records and the chaos of the wartime period. Historians who have studied the field operations, including Sheldon Harris, whose 1994 book, Factories of Death, remains one of the most comprehensive English-language studies, have produced a wide range of casualty estimates. The higher figures, sometimes reaching into the hundreds of thousands, include not only direct victims of the attacks, but also deaths from secondary epidemic spread, plague and cholera outbreaks that continue to move through communities long after the initial deployment. Other historians consider these upper estimates unreliable, arguing that wartime epidemics had multiple causes and that attributing all plague deaths in a region to a single biological attack overstates the evidence. The honest answer is that we do not know the precise toll, and we may never know. What we do know is that Unit 731 was not a rogue operation. It was funded, authorized, and overseen by the Imperial Japanese Army's Central Command. Ishii Shiro reported to the Army's Surgeon General. The biological weapons program had its own budget, its own supply chain, and its own chain of command running all the way to Tokyo. This was not the work of one mad scientist. In August 1945, the war ended twice for Unit 731. First, on August 6 and 9, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then, on August 9, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Soviet forces advanced rapidly toward Harbin. Ishii Shiro had prepared for this. He had known for months that the war was lost. On his orders, the Pingfang complex was systematically destroyed. The laboratories were demolished. The documents were burned. The bacterial cultures were incinerated or buried. The remaining prisoners, estimates vary, but likely several hundred people, were killed. Some accounts describe prisoners being given lethal injections. Others describe them being shot. The crematorium ran continuously. The staff were assembled and given a final order. The secret of Unit 731 dies with you. Anyone who revealed what had happened at Pingfang would be found and killed. The personnel were then dispersed, some fleeing south toward Korea and Japan, others scattering into the Manchurian countryside. Not everyone escaped. Soviet forces captured a number of Unit 731 personnel as they advanced. These prisoners would later be put on trial. But the most consequential decision about Unit 731's legacy was made not in Moscow, but in Washington. In the months and years following the war, American intelligence officers tracked down Ishii Shiro and several of his senior researchers. They interrogated them, and what they learned presented the United States with a choice. Ishii and his team possessed the only large-scale human experimental data on biological warfare agents in existence. The data covered the effects of plague, cholera, anthrax, and other pathogens on living human beings, information that could not be obtained through any ethical means and that no other nation possessed. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was a rising threat. American military planners were deeply interested in biological warfare, both offensive and defensive capabilities. The decision was made at the highest levels. In exchange for their complete cooperation and the transfer of all experimental data, the members of Unit 731 were granted immunity from prosecution. No charges would be filed. No trials would be held. The data would be classified and transferred to the United States Army's Biological Warfare Program at Fort Detrick, Maryland. This was not a secret negotiation conducted by rogue agents. It was a policy decision, documented in internal communications that were eventually declassified in the late 20th century. The key figures on the American side included Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Sanders, who conducted the initial interrogations in 1945, who traveled to Japan in 1947 to finalize the arrangement. In December 1949, the Soviet Union held the Khabarovsk war crimes trial, prosecuting 12 captured Japanese personnel for their involvement in biological warfare. The defendants confessed. The evidence was substantial. The verdicts were guilty. The Western press dismissed the trial as Soviet propaganda. The United States government refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the proceedings. The Khabarovsk verdicts were ignored by the international community for decades. Ishii Shiro returned to Japan. He was never arrested. He was never charged. He was never tried. According to various post-war accounts, he lived quietly in Tokyo, where he reportedly operated a small medical clinic. Some sources suggest he converted to Catholicism in his later years. These details are drawn from secondary accounts and are difficult to verify independently. What is confirmed is that he died on October 9, 1959, of laryngeal cancer at the age of 67. He was buried without public ceremony. He never faced a single day in court. But Ishii's case was not unique. It was the pattern. Many of the physicians and researchers who had worked at Unit 731 returned to civilian life in Japan and built distinguished post-war careers. Some entered academia. Former Unit 731 researchers held positions at Japanese universities, published medical papers, and trained the next generation of physicians. Others entered the pharmaceutical industry. The most frequently cited example is the Green Cross Corporation, a blood products company founded in 1950 by several former military physicians, some of whom had connections to the wartime biological weapons program. Green Cross became one of Japan's largest pharmaceutical firms before being absorbed into other companies in the late 1990s following a scandal involving contaminated blood products. The Japanese government's official position on Unit 731 has evolved slowly and incompletely. For decades, the government denied that the unit had conducted human experiments. In 2002, a Tokyo district court ruled, in a case brought by Chinese plaintiffs, that Unit 731 had indeed used biological weapons and conducted human experimentation. However, the court dismissed the plaintiffs' claims for compensation, ruling that individuals could not sue a foreign government under Japanese law. As of today, Japan has never issued a formal specific apology for the activities of Unit 731. The subject remains politically sensitive in Japan, where it intersects with broader debates about wartime responsibility, textbook content, and relations with China and Korea. The United States declassified most of the relevant documents in the 1990s and early 2000s. The data that Ishii's team provided, the fruit of thousands of deaths, was evaluated by American researchers at Fort Detrick. According to subsequent assessments, much of the data was of limited scientific value. The experiments had been conducted with poor controls, inconsistent methodology, and results that were difficult to replicate or apply. The price paid for the data, the immunity of its creators, was, by the judgment of the scientists who eventually reviewed it, not worth it. The deal that shielded Unit 731 from justice did not even produce useful intelligence. Today, on the outskirts of Harbin, the Pingfang site is a museum. The Unit 731 Museum was designated a Chinese National Historical Site and opened in its current form in 2015, though earlier exhibitions existed at the location since the 1980s. Visitors walk through the ruins of the laboratories, the foundations of the prison blocks, the remnants of the railway spur that brought prisoners to the facility. Display cases contain surgical instruments, ceramic bomb casings designed to deliver plague-infected fleas, and photographs of the complex in operation. It is one of the quietest museums in China. There are no crowds, there are no gift shops. There are only the bones of a building and the weight of what happened inside it. In Korea, the history of Unit 731 is taught, remembered, and argued over, but it is not resolved. Korean victims have never received individual recognition or compensation. The names of most Korean Maruta are unknown and will likely remain unknown. They were taken from a colonized country, transported to a foreign facility, killed in experiments, and cremated. They left no graves, no markers, no records with their names. The Netflix series Gyeongseong Creature is fiction. Its monster is imaginary. Its characters are invented. But the question it asks is real. What happens when a state decides that certain human beings are not human? What happens when a government builds a system with budgets, supply chains, personnel files, and official cover stories to treat people as raw material? The answer is Pingfang. The answer is Maruta. The answer is 3,000 to 12,000 people, the honest range of estimates, because the perpetrators made sure we would never know the exact number, who entered a building disguised as a lumber mill and never came out. The show invented a parasite that turned people into monsters. The real history needed no parasite. The system itself was the organism. It infected a military bureaucracy, a medical establishment, and eventually the intelligence apparatus of the country that defeated Japan. It turned physicians into executioners, lumber mills into death camps, and human beings into logs. And for 40 years, the world agreed to call it classified. The logs were never named, but they are remembered in a museum on the outskirts of Harbin, in the testimony of the researchers who finally spoke, in the court cases that have been filed and dismissed and filed again, and now in a Korean drama that millions of people around the world have watched on their screens. Gyeongseong Creature did not tell this story. No drama could, but it opened a door. And for many viewers, in Korea, in Japan, in the United States, and around the world, it was the first time they had ever heard the word Maruta. Now you know who they were.